Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I would like to welcome all of you to today's plenary discussion on trade and sustainability. My name is Natalie Bernasconi, and I'm the Executive Director of IISD Europe. And for those of you who may not be familiar with us, IISD stands for the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Today, we will discuss trade from the perspective of delivering the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. But our discussion really needs to be seen in a new context, the world of COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic has shaken up lives, businesses, and economies. The unprecedented situation has forced us to rethink our work towards fulfilling the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Perhaps never before have we understood as clearly as today how very mutually dependent and interconnected we all are. At the same time, our countries have never been as closed. In this new reality, we need to reassess the role of trade and trade policy and reorient it towards supporting the shift to sustainable development and progress towards a range of objectives in the 2030 Agenda. It is therefore my immense pleasure to welcome you all to this discussion today to put forward ideas on how this could be done. This plenary session is designed to frame and provide inspiration for the stream of sessions focused on sustainability throughout the week. A panel of leaders from different sectors will discuss how trade and trade policy interrelates with the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and its 17 goals. We will explore the interrelationships both in the context of COVID-19 response in the short or medium term, but also with a view to the longer-term design of an environmentally and socially sustainable sound regime of trade. So our panelists today will share their views on how trade policy should be reshaped on key sustainable development issues. We will hear about climate change, fisheries subsidies and plastics, biodiversity, agriculture, jobs, and health. But before I present our panelists, I would like to draw your attention to the chat box on your screen. Please feel free to type in your questions and comments at any time. If time allows, we will read some of the questions posed to the speakers at the end. But now back to our speakers, whom I would like to present to you briefly before we begin our discussion. First, I would like to present to you Ambassador John Merton. Ambassador Merton is the UK envoy to the 26th UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties, or in short, COP26. And as you all know, the UK will be the host of this big event next year. I also have the pleasure of welcoming Ambassador Albert Muchanga. Ambassador Muchanga is Commissioner for Trade and Industry at the African Union Commission. We also have with us today Ms. Suri Moon. Ms. Moon is co-director of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute here in Geneva. All the way from Montreal, the headquarters of the Convention on Biological Diversity, we have Mr. Alexander Shestakov. And Mr. Shestakov is director of the Science, Society, and Sustainable Futures Division at the Biodiversity Convention, the CBD. From the neighboring International Labour Organization, ILO, in Geneva, I would like to welcome Mr. Moustapha Kamal Guillet. Mr. Guillet is coordinator of the Green Jobs Program at the ILO. And finally, we are very pleased to have with us Miss Elizabeth Wilson. Miss Wilson is the Senior Director of Environmental Policy with the Pew Charitable Trusts. We have a great lineup of speakers, and if I may ask before we move on to the host, do we have all the speakers present? As some of us were having some issues connecting, and I just want to be sure that everybody's here. So I'm assuming that yes, otherwise somebody should maybe intervene to let me know if someone is missing. I would like to begin without further ado, by inviting my colleagues from IISD to introduce some questions to our speakers to kick off the discussion. Speakers will be able to respond and have up to 5 minutes in this round of questions. I'd like to first call upon Alice Tipping. Alice leads our work on fisheries subsidies and also the intersection of trade and climate change. Alice, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Natalie. I'm afraid I've just received a message that John Merton's power connection may have gone off. So with your permission, Natalie, perhaps what I might do is in fact ask my first question of Elizabeth Wilson, given that we have her on the line, so as not to delay things too much. Does that work?
Sure.
Certainly. Elizabeth, thank you again very much for joining us. The WTO's negotiations on fisheries subsidies are at a crucial stage. After 20 years of negotiations, the talks seem to have a hard deadline now, set in SDG 14.6 for conclusion this year. And many scientific studies, including many that Pew has funded, suggest that removing harmful subsidies could actually lead to significantly healthier fish stocks and more catch for fishes in the long run. But this, of course, is going to require collective action by all WTO member governments. Now, collective action is also, of course, required to reduce the amount of plastic waste that enters the oceans each year. And in fact, other science that we know Pew has funded suggests that without real policy change, the flow of plastic into the world's ocean could in fact triple by 2040. So it seems that international trade policy probably has an important role to play in resolving both of these questions. So we'd be very interested to hear from Pew's perspective, why is the WTO deal on fisheries subsidies so important? And how could trade policy perhaps be part of the solution in reducing marine plastic pollution? Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thank you to the Graduate Institute and IISD for organizing this important and timely event. The UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development includes many targets important for a sustainable blue economy. The first deadlines under SDG 14, the Ocean SDG, are just 93 days away. These deadlines come at a time when many are waking up to the inextricable connections between humans and our environment. This should be a time for pushing for progress, not missing agreed deadlines. One of these targets with a rapidly approaching deadline is SDG 14.6, which in summary calls for reducing harmful fisheries subsidies by 2020. This target's critical to achieve. Governments around the world continue incentivizing fishing beyond sustainable levels by providing more than $22 billion in harmful fisheries subsidies annually. These harmful subsidies, such as those for fuel or vessel construction, artificially lower the cost of fishing and jeopardize the health of fish stocks in fishing communities. According to research by Chris Costello, an ambitious WTO fisheries subsidies agreement could increase global fish biomass by 13% by 2060, thus having significant implications for food security and livelihoods. Given this, we're pleased that negotiations have resumed and that WTO members are engaging constructively in discussion around the chair's text. It will be important for negotiators to focus on the overfishing and overcapacity pillar of the text, since it's here that an agreement can have the greatest impact. What members agree under this pillar sets the level of ambition for the agreement, and it's vital that this includes a prohibition on subsidies that enable overfishing and feed overcapacity, regardless of whether it's for fishing in a country's EEZ, on the high seas, or in the waters of another country. There are, of course, challenges brought about by COVID-19, but WTO members have what they need to reach an agreement this year. And they have at their fingertips a unique opportunity to improve ocean health, show that WTO members can cooperate to deliver an outcome of global importance, and that trade policy mechanisms are an effective way to reach high-ambition global targets. This would be an important precedent for other topics, such as plastic pollution, which is the other topic Alice has asked me about. SDG 14.1 sets a target of, by 2025, preventing and significantly reducing marine pollution of all kinds. So this, of course, includes plastic pollution. As Alice mentioned, in July, Pew, Systemic, and other FAT partners released a report called Breaking the Plastic Wave, and a related paper was published in the journal Science. The research projects that by 2040, under business as usual, plastic generation will double, plastic going into the ocean will triple, and the amount of plastic waste in the ocean will quadruple. The report identifies 8 measures that together could reduce by 2040 about 80% of the annual plastic pollution entering the ocean. These include reducing growth in plastic production and consumption, substituting some plastics with alternatives, designing products and packaging for recycling, expanding waste collection rates in middle and low-income countries, increasing recycling, and reducing plastic waste exports. Reducing plastic waste exports is among the solutions because there's growing evidence that some of the plastic scrap exported from high-income countries to lower-income countries has little market value and can be mismanaged through open burning or illegal dumping. Therefore, we welcome the efforts under the Basel Convention to reduce trade in problematic plastic waste. But we also see enormous potential in trade policy measures focused on pre-consumer plastics. For example, measures could be put in place that reduce subsidies to single-use plastics or to accelerate the use of sustainable alternatives to plastics. Therefore, we're working with Carolyn Deer-Birkbeck at the Graduate Institute and others to look more closely at what role trade policy could play in reducing plastic pollution. We're encouraged to see so many governments interested in these ideas, and we hope that this is an area for significant future progress. In conclusion, fisheries subsidies and plastic pollution offer 2 concrete opportunities to use trade policy to advance the 2030 Agenda objectives. If you're interested in hearing about these opportunities in more detail, there are sessions on both topics later this week. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Ms. Wilson, and for calling or telling WTO members again about the importance of this environmental issue, which is very closely linked to trade, and then also the fact that these fisheries subsidies negotiations could be a precedent for further work in other areas to achieve other sustainable development goals. And you mentioned here plastics, and also very much showing the importance of on the one hand, of the WTO, but at the same time also the importance of multilateral environmental agreements. And you mentioned the Basel Convention. And we, of course, have the pleasure today to have 2 major MEAs here, multilateral environmental agreements, discussed here, one being on climate change and the other on biological diversity. And I just saw now that Ambassador Merton is back, and sorry for the inconvenience, Ambassador. Welcome. We changed the order of the interveners just now, and so you have already been preceded by Ms. Wilson from the Pew Charitable Trusts. And I'm very happy to give you the floor now. I think it flows well from the Ms. Wilson's discussion prior to you. And I'll invite Alice Tipping again to ask you a leading question to kick off this discussion. Alice?
Thank you, Natalie, and welcome back, Ambassador. It's good to have you with us again. Listen, just to kind of take a step back, I mean, the ultimate objective of all agreements under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is, of course, to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in our atmosphere at a level that will prevent dangerous human interference in the climate system, and that in a time frame that will allow ecosystems to adapt and that enables sustainable development. It's been almost 5 years, I understand, since governments agreed in Paris to keep increases in the global temperature within 2 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial levels. And many governments, states, provinces, businesses, and individuals are really working to make this possible. The UK government has written net zero commitments into law, for instance. But our sense is that a much more substantial transformation of economic activity is still going to be needed. And that suggests to us that trade policy is going to need to be part of that solution. We know the UK is hosting COP26 in November next year and has an important opportunity to catalyse this sort of a discussion. So from your perspective, how do you think trade policy could be part of the discussion at COP26 next year? Is there a role it could play in supporting mitigation and adaptation to climate change? I think you're currently muted, Ambassador. You might.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you all. And apologies for disappearing. There was an unexpected power cut in my corner of Kent, and so I was temporarily marooned from the world. Well, first thing I should say is I'm absolutely not a trade expert, and so everything that you hear from me has to be seen in context. But I know a little bit about climate change, so try and answer your question best I can. And I think one of the things to note as we look at 26 is Glasgow COP26 will be very different than Paris. We're not trying to reach a global agreement in quite the same way as we were in Paris. There are elements of the rulebook that need to be negotiated, but what we're trying to do is stretch the agreement and implement it and deliver emissions reductions and improvements in adaptation and resilience. And to get the major mitigation benefits out of COP26 and to show that Paris can deliver reductions in emissions, we need to get the major industrialized trading nations to change their behavior. And for this, arguably, trade policy is key. When I started this job, someone very wise said to me, ultimately, all climate policy is a derivative of trade policy because of the fear of going first and the fear of burdening one's economy with additional costs. But as Montreal and the agreement to cut gases that hurt the ozone layer showed, if we all jump together, we can have a huge effect. And this fear of going first, I would argue, stems from a period when, in order to deliver reductions in emissions, you had to trade off some economic growth. And that was true in Copenhagen, and it was true to an extent again in Paris. But I think what we're seeing now is actually a change in that. And that arguably the economics of renewables, the economics of many of the technologies that will deliver emissions reductions have changed sufficiently quickly that in a post-COVID world, as we try and get our economies going again, we can argue that actually, in order to grow our economies, we need to green our economies. Solar power, battery storage have both come down by about 85% in cost over the course of the last decade and are set to come down further over the coming decade. Sometimes people get a little bit confused when they look at the stock of investment versus investment flow. And it's important to, when you're trying to detect change, to look at flow. So if you look at Bloomberg's latest figures, although renewable energy still only accounts for a relatively small percentage of global energy production, solar and wind alone accounted for over 2/3 of the new installed capacity that was put in globally last year. So the momentum has very definitely swung towards renewables, and the cost of renewables means that momentum is set to increase. And I think it was a Saudi oil minister who once said that the Stone Age didn't run out because we ran out of stones. We found something better. And in the same way, the oil age won't end because we ran out of oil. And it was just a couple of weeks ago that BP, the world's 4th largest oil company, essentially committed to becoming net zero by 2050, announced we'd passed peak oil, and pledged to commit to reducing its oil and gas output by 30 to 40% over the next decade. Because it's realized to protect shareholder value, it needs to make that transition. And COVID has only accelerated these trends. And as a result, we all have the technology we need to reach net zero. And I would argue that much of the economics are in place to reach net zero. Where we have a lack in capacity at the moment is the politics. And it's the politics that are dragging. And it's the politics that will stop us getting to net zero globally quick enough to meet our climate goals and to realise the goals of the Paris Agreement to limit temperature rise to no more than 2 degrees centigrade. And that's because although it's in a nation's economic interest to transition to sort of a low carbon economy, and we can model that very clearly, ending, for example, coal production or oil and gas production comes with a political cost that is felt very particularly by communities who are engaged in the production of those assets. And that's why transition can be particularly hard if you're trying to do it as the first mover. So, for example, if you look at the European Union, they have their proposal to reduce emissions by 55% by 2030, but that's really going to affect coal mining communities in Germany and Poland and others. And if political leaders can't say that actually they're working to support those communities politically and economically through that change, it's very difficult. And that's why the European Union has talked on a couple of occasions about carbon border adjustment mechanisms as a way to try and get to zero in a way that doesn't damage the European economy. I don't think necessarily that's the right answer. I'm not sure that that's where the EU will actually end up. But that talk of carbon border adjustment mechanisms, I'm sure, is part of the reason that Beijing, for example, last week committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2060, to realize that they need to be inside the growing world of low carbon trade. We know that trade in low carbon goods and services is set to increase in the region of 20 to 30 times by the year 2050. It's a growing part of the world economy that we want to be a part of. And so the UK is trying to use our own trade policy to advance that. And you've seen, and I know Julian Braithwaite will talk later in the week about our Green 100 and how we're trying to lower tariffs on goods that support the green economy. And how we're working to revise our agricultural policy to reward environmental protection rather than production, and also to make sure that the UK economy is well positioned to take advantage of the massive changes that we will see, for example, as a result of the adoption of zero-emission vehicles. The average zero-emission vehicle has 1,500 moving parts and a global supply chain to boot. The average zero-emission vehicle has 50 moving parts, and global supply chains will be radically different as a result, and trade policy will need to reflect that. And even where we see occasionally tariffs being increased on solar panels in certain countries, arguably that's because they're taking renewable energy seriously and showing a recognition of the fact that it's a strategic industry that they want to have a piece of. So we can use trade policy to address a lot of these issues. It's not simple. I imagine it's going to be very complex and a major piece of work for Julian and all the other WTO negotiators over the years to come. But it's really important that we do, in order to help countries around the world not only achieve emissions reductions even faster, but also clear out some of the ways that the barriers to stopping countries becoming more resilient in the face of ongoing climate change. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Ambassador. And of course, this recognition, we have all we need technologically and economically, but the problem is really politics that's stopping us. I think that you know, this obviously can be applied across the board in many international sort of endeavors. And I suppose here, over the past few years with the technological developments, this is even more true in this area that's developing so fast of the clean energy transition. And of course, you mentioned the issue of coal mining, of jobs, and also border carbon adjustments. And these are certainly issues that we will be talking about also today a bit more. In particular, we have ILO representative here, Mustafa Kamal Guye, and we'll be coming back to that issue as well. So thank you for raising those. I think that the issue of border carbon adjustments surely will be a topic that will be quite discussed this week, because it is something that everybody in the trade community is looking at. So we will probably hear some more about that this week as well. Now, oh, and you also mentioned agriculture and reviewing agricultural policy also from a climate perspective. And that is a very good segue to our next speaker, the Honorable Albert Muchanga, who is the Commissioner for Trade and Industry at the African Union. Welcome, Ambassador. Sorry you had some issues connecting. Some others of us did as well. So I'm glad you were able to join us nevertheless. And now I would like to invite my colleague, Jonathan Hepburn from IISD, to kick off a discussion around trade and food security. So Jonathan, please go ahead and ask your question to the Honorable Mr. Muchanga.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Thank you, Commissioner Muchanga. So just to provide a little bit of context for the discussion here. So we know that COVID-19 has set back efforts to raise incomes, create jobs and support livelihoods around the globe. In Africa, the loss of jobs and livelihoods has also jeopardized access to food for some of the continent's poorest citizens. And we know that this also undermines efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal number 2 targets on ending hunger and malnutrition. Meanwhile, amid rising global tensions on trade between major economies, the WTO talks have struggled to achieve progress, including on agricultural trade and other African priorities. And at the same time, the pandemic has also meant that African countries have had to postpone implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the AFCFTA. So, Commissioner, the question I would like to ask you is, what are the challenges that lie ahead for meeting the agriculture-related targets of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its SDGs? And what is trade's role in helping or hindering progress in that respect? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be with all of you this afternoon. Indeed, you had some challenges logged in, but I think you were not the only ones. And the good thing is that we are able to do it ultimately, which is very, very, very good. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused a lot of disruptions globally. And for Africa, one of the downturns is that the progress that we made in reducing poverty is going to be slowed. And in its place, we are going to have increased poverty levels. And that depends very much on the economic reform programs that the African governments are going to come up with. So it's a real challenge. And as a result of that, growing poverty, food insecurity is also emerging as a problem. Right now, close to about 277 million people to 399 million people annually are food insecure. And this goes against the background where a majority of our economies are fully dependent on the agricultural sector. The general average is about 24%, but you have other countries whose agriculture accounts for as much as 60.9% of their GDP. So this is the background against which we come. And when the COVID-19 pandemic emerged on a part of our continent, and like in other parts of the world, there was a very significant disruption of the supply chains at the global, regional, and the national levels. So we had to work very, very fast in coming up with the trade corridors and also mobilizing the private sector to come in supplying food and other personal protective personal equipment. And of course, when you have such a situation, there's also an element of panic buying, but that has been resolved now. So these are some of the disruptions of COVID-19 pandemic. And against this background, we had intended to roll out the African Continental Free Trade Area on the 1st of July this year, but everything was disrupted, and we've now come up with a new target date, which is going to be the 1st of January next year. So we are making preparations towards that. And we feel that we're going to be able to have the summit to approve all the preparations, and we should be able to roll out the market. And in as far as agriculture is concerned, I think it will be very well catered for. Some of the measures that we are embarking on are related to liberalization of trade, including agricultural products. So there's agreement on about 90%, and then we're also coming up with a regime on the rules of origin. And again, there's the agreement there. So that is going to really promote agro-processing, and that is key to ensuring that we remove the current situation where Africa is a net importer of food. So I think the figure is somewhere around the 70 million, and is likely to increase to about 110 billion US dollars per year if we do not overcome the issue of dependence on imported food products. And in order to ensure that we have a market that is really attractive and thriving, other than reducing tariffs, non-tariff barriers also sometimes play a role in ensuring that trade is more or less frustrated. So we have come up with a very operational instrument on the monitoring, reporting, and elimination of non-tariff barriers. It's fully operational. People can visit, and then we are also coming up with measures to promote investment by working on the protocol on investment, which is going to really attract both large-scale and small-scale investors to go into various areas of investment. And we are also in the process of developing a quality policy to promote harmonization, and also eventually to ensure that we remove technical barriers to trade, among others. Now, against this background, I think, like indicated, the multilateral trading system is not very, it does not promote the development of trade, especially in as far as agricultural trade is involved. There are a lot of distortions, and with these distortions, it's very difficult to for Africa to really move ahead. But with the establishment of the African market, we should be able to promote the spirit of self-reliance so that we are able to overcome it. But as things stand now, the fact that the COVID-19 has really more or less stalled the efforts towards poverty reduction. As things stand now, there is an increase in poverty across Africa. It will be very difficult to meet the challenges, to the targets set out in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as far as it is concerned to goal number 2 is quite a challenge. So the key is to countries to really come up with a very aggressive economic reform programs anchored on export diversification, as well as producing the diversification through the African Continental Free Trade Area. So far, the picture is very grim, but we are working with the member states to ensure that we come up with the recovery programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. And it is indeed very sad to see that the progress on poverty reduction and food security has been put at risk with this pandemic. And at the same time, I see a lot of optimism on your part with respect to the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and what you can do at the regional level to address some of these problems. And this optimism is not as shared, I suppose, for what is happening right now on agriculture, or has happened in the past on agriculture at the multilateral level, as you mentioned, many trade barriers. But overall, I think that the international community surely has to come together now to see this big risk of food insecurity in the clearly in the face, and also do something quickly about it. So thank you very much, Commissioner, for that. That leads us to the issue of jobs. And I would like to invite or welcome Mr. Mustafa Kamal Guille, and invite Peter Wooders from IISD to kick off our discussion with Mr. Guille today. Peter is IISD's Senior Director on Energy. So thank you and welcome again, Mustafa. It's great to have you with us. Peter?
Yeah, thank you, Natalie, and absolutely, you're very, very welcome, Mustafa. And it's very clear that the ILO and the focus that you've had on jobs, on sustainability and trade and bringing them all together is incredibly important as we look to 2030, and also in the response to the COVID crisis. It's very clear that whatever countries do, they've got to take employment and opportunity as a very, very central part of that. We heard from Ambassador Merton before about the just transition, but it obviously goes a lot more wide than that into all sectors of the economy. So yeah, the importance of decent work in achieving sustainable development is clearly highlighted within Goal 8 of the SDGs, and that aims to promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all. Mustafa, how could trade policy be designed to help achieve this objective, especially with the new challenges we've now got posed by COVID-19?
For having me in this session. I must start by saying that the COVID-19 pandemic profoundly affected the world of work. We've seen a massive economic and social disruption, which we all know have long-term consequences. The ILO has estimated that over 400 million enterprises worldwide, and this includes employers and own account workers, that have been exposed to the risk of severe disruption in those sectors that have been hardest hit by this pandemic and the crisis. And this includes manufacturing, wholesale trade, and retail trade as well. And I must also say that the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, which account for 2/3 of jobs worldwide, and represent around 70% of global employment in retail trade, are particularly in danger. Many of the enterprises that operate in the informal economy have been severely disrupted, and this has led to a consequence of 1.6 billion workers in the informal economy that today are in difficulty. And I also want to highlight that in those sectors that are being mostly impacted, including wholesale and retail trade, we see a large number of women workers. The ILO has estimated that globally almost 510 million, and this represents 40% of women employed are in those hard-hit sectors. Now, this doesn't mean that we are in a whole gloomy picture. I think there is another side of the coin, which is possibly a positive narrative. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated a capacity to develop innovative solutions for health and environmental goals, and these could stimulate local and global trade and drive employment creation. And I first want to highlight the reorganization of supply chains. We've heard it from Ambassador, but the COVID-19 pandemic has pushed a number of companies to rethink their supply chain management by integrating safety stocks. For example, instead of relying on the traditional practice of just-in-time inventory, some companies have went to develop alternative micro supply chains that rely on domestic suppliers, and these are also closer to consumption markets. So such a sourcing pattern that we have seen can promote the development of new businesses in local supply chains. This can also open opportunities in the logistics and trade facilitation services. And also importantly, there is an opportunity to reduce emissions related to the international transportation of goods. Secondly, I want to note the diversification in production and sourcing. The disruption that we have seen in the global food supply chains have triggered a new appetite for urban farming. We've seen in cities like Bangkok, Paris, more city residents going on to produce their own vegetables and food in their homes. And if you take the example of a country like Singapore, which currently imports more than 90% of its food, Singapore aims to produce 30% of its nutritional needs locally by 2030. It has encouraged communities, social enterprises to go into urban farming, and this will create jobs and income locally. And this is something that could be done elsewhere. Now, if you look at a region like Africa, in Ghana, we have seen startups that develop drones that deliver medicine and equipment in the medical sector to health centers. And whoever knows Accra knows the type of congestion that you see there. But this would be possible avoiding road-based transportation. In South Africa, we've seen social enterprises that got into the local manufacturing of respirators, and they use local material. These are reusable. And one of them got an award at the first Africa Innovation and Investment Forum in 2020. So therefore, one important point of conclusion is that obviously the COVID-19 crisis has caused a massive disruption in the global economy and trade. However, it opens up new opportunities to rethink global and local systems of production and consumption, supply chains, trade, and I think all of this can create new opportunities for local innovation, sustainable trade, and decent work creation that can take us towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So in the short term, I think governments could consider what kind of actions they could take to stimulate and support this type of innovation and entrepreneurship that we have seen to promote productive employment and decent work in this new context. And going in the long term, I think it would be important to think of revamping the production capacities so that we can ensure resilience, security, and sustainability in the production and consumption of goods and services. And I think this is particularly important in the food and health sector. Thank you very much.
All right, Natalie, I think you're muted.
Oh, I'm actually not muted. Can you can't hear me?
No, we hear you now.
Yep, you're back.
Okay, I wasn't muted actually, sorry. Or it didn't show up this way. So I was just saying and thanking Mr. Guillet for this intervention and how well it flows from the discussion before, and in particular also the commissioner's sort of focus on the regional opportunities for Africa. And what you're mentioning as well is, to rethink local production and consumption, shortening supply chains, making them more local and opening new opportunities for that. I think that's probably something that we wouldn't have imagined or thought about as vigorously as we have in the past months with this pandemic going on. That it really, you really showed quite a few openings that came to light of rethinking our economy. So thank you very much, Mr. Guille, for that. I would like to now move to the issue of health. And of course, we're talking about a health pandemic with tremendous impacts, not only on health, and as we heard from previous speakers, on the economy and trade. And so I'm very happy to welcome Siri Moon, who is co-director of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute, to share her thoughts with us. And I would like to invite my colleague Sofia Balino to kick off our discussion with Ms. Moon. Sofia oversees and manages the publications of IISD's Economic Law and Policy program, and also frequently writes and has written on trade for many years. So Sofia, I know you're a little bit down with a cold, but I'm glad to have you here anyway.
Thanks so much, Natalie, and hello everyone. It's really good to be here. So the COVID-19 pandemic has really brought back to the fore the long-standing debate over whether the current global trading regime is effective in responding to public health challenges, including such a wide-scale challenge as this current pandemic. Among the questions that have been debated in various forums, such as this year's World Health Assembly, was how best to use the flexibilities in the WTO's TRIPS agreement, given also the 2001 Doha Declaration on the TRIPS agreement and public health, the need for sharing data, technologies, and other tools crucial for developing an effective vaccine and treatment for COVID, has prompted initiatives such as the Solidarity Call to Action and the Technology Access Pool. Meanwhile, concerns over whether vaccine, once available and effective, will be distributed equitably has prompted the launch of COVAX, the vaccine-focused arm of the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator. There have also been concerns raised over export bans that may affect the transport of medical goods and other vital products. Meanwhile, a September 2020 report published in the Lancet Public Health Journal noted that the pandemic is likely to slow down efforts to fulfill various other parts of the health-related SDGs, particularly SDG 3 on healthy lives and well-being. And the authors have documented the various adverse impacts that can range from screening for non-communicable diseases to the provision of vaccines for children. So a question to Dr. Moon, based on her extensive research on issues at the intersection of global governance and public health, especially in relation to how to make trade, investment, and IP rules more health sensitive, is in light of this pandemic, what lessons have we learned in terms of how effective and fit for purpose the current global trading system is in response to public health crises, and what is needed next? Where are we headed?
Thank you very much, Sofia. Dr. Moon, are you ready to respond to some of Sofia's question?
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And I think in the question you really covered the broad scope of health issues that intersect with the trade arena, and I think we don't need any further reminders of why health matters for trade and why trade matters for health. I think in the health sector we have spent a lot of our time and energy focusing on intellectual property, and I want to come back to that in just a second. But I think building on what some of the previous speakers highlighted regarding export bans and really the breakdown of trade, particularly in the earliest months of the pandemic, I wanted to highlight some of the concerns that continue to be I think, front and center for the health community regarding inadequate trade or blocks on trade in medical goods. So whether we're talking about personal protective equipment, vaccines will very soon be on the table, raw materials as well as finished products in terms of medicines. I mean, these are really the kinds of trade barriers that can absolutely cripple our ability to respond to this pandemic. And unfortunately, what we saw earlier this year was that many countries, I think understandably, began to block these exports. This was a real disaster, but it seemed that the trade system really was not adequate to address this issue. So I think one of the big challenges that I would like to put on the table is, what is it that we can do to improve both trade rules and the adjudication of those rules that would, in fact, allow us to address these types of problems in the future. I think if we think about the pre-COVID world, which seems like a distant memory now, but a lot of times countries actually are very slow to share information about outbreaks happening on their territory because they fear the trade repercussions. And despite that being a well-known problem, again, we've not come to any solutions within the trade system on how do we ensure that trade restrictions are managed in such a way that they don't unfairly punish countries, whether it's countries that need access to products or countries whose exports are harmed by fears of importing countries. And I think this is we need big out of the picture, hopefully not out of the picture, out of the box thinking. I should say, from our trade experts on this. I think this leads naturally to the second key issue I wanted to highlight, which is about what some people have called renationalization, or this push for local production of health technologies, whether that's drugs or vaccines or personal protective equipment. And of course, there was always this dream that the trade system would lead to a hyper-efficient global economy, that there would be zero trade barriers between countries, and that everybody would be better off. I mean, this remains the textbook abstract theoretical ideal, I think, for many trade economists. And what COVID really illustrated very clearly was that's not the world we live in. Of course, we still live in a world of sovereign states where overnight you can have trade restrictions that in fact block that reality from that vision from being realized. And so for me, there is a much greater interest today in local production. And I think that's very understandable. And the key question is not whether local production of essential health technologies makes sense. It absolutely makes sense in more countries than we've had it today. The key question for me is whether the trade system will have the flexibility in the existing rules to allow for that. Because what we'll often see is that deep state engagement will be required in order to get local production efforts off the ground, whether that is subsidies, tax breaks, whether that is facilitating technology transfer, preferential treatment of domestic industries for the first 10 plus years. I mean, all of these are classic policy tools that governments would use to support local production. Not always obvious that these would be permitted under existing trade rules. But I think if we take a step back, we think about the big picture, we want a system of trade in medicines and vaccines that is resilient, that is adequate. And in order to do that, we need more redundancy in the system, and that a hyper-efficient system is not necessarily what offers the most security to countries. Let me come back very quickly and very briefly to the issue of intellectual property, because I think this does remain, of course, a really key and central issue. And if we think about the TRIPS agreement and the core IP agreement, the core IP multilateral agreement, the objective of that agreement is both to incentivize innovation, to promote innovation, and to promote technology transfer and access. But I think there has been a real imbalance, and there's been a lot of emphasis on the protection of IP and really totally inadequate emphasis on the question of technology transfer. And if we think about what does TRIPS and the broader trade system and all of the IP provisions that exist in bilateral, multilateral agreements, what do the agreements need to do? I think we've really failed to build a system that promotes and facilitates and ensures adequate technology transfer. And we see this very clearly illustrated today with the vaccine issue, where we don't have adequate global capacity to produce enough vaccines for everybody. This has led to a desperate scramble by many countries to get what they can early, but not enough attention to actually expanding that pie through technology transfer and rapid ramping up of production capacity. And so we have a system that has not yet adequately figured out how do we ensure, even in the most urgent emergencies, how do we make tech transfer happen? And I think this is an ongoing challenge for the trade system and the IP rules that are really governed within the trade system.
Thank you very much. I'm assuming you can hear me now, unless somebody makes a sign. Thank you very much, Dr. Boone, for those interventions. And it's really quite interesting what you're saying. On the one hand, there were restrictions put in place that, in principle, are not as such allowed. But we won't go into detail. But they're not really the preferred option under the trade rules to restrict exports. So on the one hand, you say we need to deal with that, but at the same time, we also need to think about the local production and technology transfer, and on the other hand, which would require a bit more possibly state intervention, and the question of to what extent does the current trade system actually support this kind of development, so that in a future health crisis, we might be in a better situation globally to share the experience, the capacity, and be able to deal with this in the best possible way. So I think that now there really is probably a very good time to think about and really discuss these issues openly that might have been taboo before the pandemic. So thank you very much for that, Suri. Now, last but not least, I would really like to welcome now Mr. Shestakov. During the pandemic, we actually heard a lot about the loss of biodiversity impacts on human health and the spread of disease. And so we're very happy to welcome Mr. Shestakov with us today to share his views on trade and biodiversity. And I would like to invite my colleague Soledad Leal Campos to ask some kickoff questions. Soledad leads our work on trade and environment and also the so-called new trade issues. So Soledad, the floor is yours, and then we very much look forward to hearing from Mr. Shestakov. Welcome.
Many thanks, Natalie. Good morning, Dr. Shestakov. Biodiversity and ecosystems feature prominently across many of the SDGs and associated targets, as they contribute directly to human well-being and development priorities. Biodiversity is at the center of many economic activities, particularly those related to crop and livestock agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. Could you please expand on the essential role of biodiversity in achieving the SDGs, while also explaining how trade and trade policies have impacted biodiversity? And how has the work under the CBD addressed trade issues over the years? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Soledad, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And thanks for those questions. It's actually a pleasure to be at this panel today and during this very important week, and actually just a day before a very important event for us, the first UN high-level summit on biodiversity. And definitely the topic of this panel is very relevant, but also extremely timely, as we probably all saw cartoons recently with the different waves of crisis. And one of those crises is actually biodiversity loss. There are many linkages between biodiversity and trade, whether we are talking about policies, but also directly linkages to the state of biodiversity globally, but also in particular in some regions of the world. The last year IPBES Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services identified trade as one of the key indirect drivers of change in biodiversity. And furthermore, other demographic and economic indirect drivers of biodiversity change, they interact in a very complex way, including through trade. But probably before I come to specific of those interlinkages, just a few words about our convention. This is one of Rio conventions of 1992, and it has a wide mandate actually on all aspects of biodiversity, which includes also ecosystems, species, and whole variety of genes and genomes. And CBD has a universal membership, 196 parties as of today. And since convention was adopted, we actually developed two major protocols, the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, dealing with international movements of living modified organisms, and also Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization. So as you can clearly see, both of those protocols are closely related to international trade issues. Sometimes there is a wrong perception of the Biodiversity Convention. It's seen as a purely conservation instrument, and sometimes even being about species and protected areas. So I would like to use this opportunity to reiterate that the CBD is not just about conservation. The convention has three equally important objectives. One of them is conservation, but the other two is sustainable use of biodiversity components and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. So all those three elements are very important for parties of this convention. Many linkages between trade in biodiversity, our parties will try to explore through actually expressing their interest in looking into trade issues since actually the inception of the convention. And as one of the results, the convention holds observer status in the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment for a couple of decades now. But at the same time, we have a number of additional requests for observer status in other committees. Those requests currently are still pending. The discussion on trade and environment has quite a long and eminent history, essentially going back to the 90s. In this context, the concept of achieving and maintaining what we call mutual supportiveness between trade policies and biodiversity policies plays a central role for us, actually at all levels, at global, regional, and national. And it's actually in this spirit of mutual supportiveness that I provide remarks today. Given the breadth of the convention, but also of the global trade regimes, linkages are really multifaceted and complex, but in a way can be probably boiled down to a couple of large strategic areas. One relates to the convention's work on addressing incentives and subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity. The convention text contains a dedicated article on incentive measures. And further to this, the current strategic plan for biodiversity for the period 2011-2020, also known as a set of Aichi targets, includes Aichi Target 3, with commitment by governments to remove, phase out, or reform incentives and subsidies that are harmful for biodiversity. Unfortunately, according to the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, launched just 2 weeks ago, the world did not deliver on this target in time by the end of this year. This target also was mirrored in SDGs, for example, in SDG 14, which contains a target on fisheries subsidies. And I think it's already was mentioned by Elizabeth in previous interventions. The convention continues to look with great interest to the ongoing discussions at the WTO on fisheries subsidies, as well as on domestic support to agriculture. We believe that successful conclusion of these talks can potentially support achieving a number of goals under the convention, but also contribute to the post-2020 period. Another area relates to the convention's work on ensuring biosafety while dealing with international movements of living modified organisms, further to its relevant provisions and Cartagena Protocol, as well as on invasive alien species. And invasive alien species also were identified as one of the 5 key direct drivers of biodiversity loss. As I mentioned, our request for observer status at WTO Committee on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures is pending. However, we had a range of very useful information exchange with SPS committee over past years, and especially on invasive alien species. And we work together with WTO colleagues, as well as with the international standard setting organizations to promote better and more sustainable and safe regimes for invasive alien species, which actually also very often can be the source of zoonotic diseases. I also wish to mention that parties had an interest to look at the relationships between the Convention's third objective on access and benefit related to genetic resources and the provisions of WTO agreement on trade-related intellectual property rights. So, and that will be very significant area of work for us. And this relation we know is complex, and resulting discussions have been really controversial in the past. So, and still forms part of the Doha negotiation agenda. And we are very much looking forward for the progress in this area. Since we experienced COVID, we can see a growing interest with certain elements of wildlife trade as potentially important vector for the spread of zoonotic diseases. We have a work stream on this under convention and also cooperate closely with WHO under its One Health approach. And of course, I like to flag the crucial importance of combating illegal and achieving sustainable international trade and wildlife in a more broad sense. This is, of course, the area and realm of our partners and friends from CITES, and we work very closely with them. So within the last minute or so, I need to say a few words about our next steps. And the next steps, we are working currently on a global biodiversity framework for the period post-2020. It's a long-term framework which is supposed to help us to achieve 2050 vision, living in harmony with nature. And although the whole framework is for the next 30 years, we have a milestone which completely coincides with the period of SDGs. So it's actually 2030. So we also see the entire global biodiversity framework as one of the tools which will support implementation of SDGs. And we also know, and it's already actually a known fact, that the global biodiversity crisis we experience today is a significant impediment for achieving SDGs. All 20 of them, all 17 of them. I'm saying 20 because that's the number of our target within IITF Global Biodiversity Framework. So we have a number of specific targets which will be related to trade directly or indirectly. Directly, trade in wildlife, and including health aspects and safety aspects, but also mainstreaming. What we call biodiversity mainstreaming is basically integration of biodiversity considerations and values in relevant policies and programs, economic sectors, and associated decision making. And definitely this is a broad umbrella which include all set of trade policies. Another significant part of the program and this global biodiversity framework will be the elements related to implementation, reporting, and monitoring. And also we see this framework, which we hope will be adopted by our COP15 next year in China, and later on by the General Assembly. So we see this framework is a framework for all. All will find their space, their place, their indicators, and their role in achieving different elements of this framework. And that's what's also true for the trade community. And on specifics, where we can continue working together on those elements, whether it's mainstreaming or incentives or trade specifically, or what was mentioned by several speakers today, that's actually making sustainable the supply chain to bring better production, but also more sustainable and actually different consumption. We're happy to work together. So at the end, just like to say that we are at the stage when probably the ways and approaches we used before doesn't work anymore, and COVID stressed it maybe once again. So we need really transformational change, including changes in the trade, including making trade actually different. And we can do it, but we can do it only if we take actions together. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this sharing these thoughts. We're running quite quickly out of time, and I just want to actually give everyone the floor to just very briefly give us or identify two to-do action points, and I think that Mr. Shestakov already indicated his two more or less, or a call to the trade community. So two action points, what governments and civil society should prioritize for action, one long-term, one short-term. And before I do that, I do want to just thank or mention one issue that came out once quite clearly in Mr. Shestakov's intervention that I think is important for all of us here. He mentioned, participating in the WTO's committees and being an observer in the Committee on Trade and Environment, but still pending admission after so many years of the WTO existence to some of the other committees. And to me, that I think is something that we need to seriously think about if we're going to create a new system or international economic governance that really takes on board and at its center has the sustainable development goals in this case, but sustainable development more generally, like the WTO instruments also clearly say. So I'm hoping that this kind of discussion will actually bring the community together more. I hope that the entire week will bring this community together more, the community of trade, but also for the trade community to open up to other areas where you have very specific expertise that can be very useful also for the discussions in the trade field. So I do hope that will happen hopefully very soon. We've waited a while. But let's go back. I'll give really maybe just, let's say 30 seconds. If you just said two quick points, one short term, one long term. And if I may just go first to Ambassador Merton from the UK, and I will just check my watch because we only have 4 minutes left. And I'd love to hear from you the 4 minutes, but I'll give you 30 seconds. Sorry about that, Ambassador. Your 2 points.
Short term. Let's not distort the market anymore and have all countries abolish export subsidies for coal and coal-fired power stations, because essentially we still have countries that are distorting global trade by supporting the most polluting of fossil fuels, which makes the tackle of dealing with climate change harder. And in the long term, all nations to set a date by which time they hope to bring their economies to climate neutral, as was done last week by President Xi of China, because that will send the really clear signals to markets about the need to expand the green economy and to make sure that the WTO community addresses the issues associated with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I do like that you put the coal issue in the immediate short term. Thank you for that. Can we go on to Ambassador Muchanga for a very short advice, what should be done short term and what should be done longer, a little bit longer term?
I had problems in their meeting. Thank you very much. For the short term, I think the agenda for Africa is really to come up with a very aggressive economic reform programs anchored on poverty reduction, without which we cannot meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And to do that, we should meet all our commitments in establishing the regional market of the African continental free trade area, anchored on increasing investments in the agricultural sector. For us, reform of the multilateral trading system should really be addressed very aggressively in the medium term. So those are the 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we hear you, and we will be tweeting these recommendations out so the world hears them. So thank you very much, Ambassador. Ms. Moon, can I ask you about one short-term or medium-term and one longer-term?
Yes, I think for the short term, I think we need much more money on the table and political support for technology transfer, particularly for COVID-19 technologies. And there are, in fact, at least 2 initiatives that have been set up already at the multilateral level, one at the WHO, one at the UN, and many bilateral potential paths for tech transfer, but unfortunately very little concrete movement. In the medium term, I would say we really need to reinterpret and, if needed, renegotiate the rules, the IP rules, to ensure that, in fact, technology transfer is right up there on an equal footing with intellectual property protection.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and being so clear and so concise, all of you. Thank you. I'll go back to Mr. No, I think I have to now go to Ms. Wilson because she hasn't been, she spoke at the very beginning. So I'd like to ask Ms. Wilson what her 2 priorities would be.
Thank you. In the short term, actually in the next 93 days, WTO members reached an agreement to sustainably reduce harmful fishery subsidies. This is the single most important decision that could be taken to help ensure long-term sustainable fisheries and fishing communities. So it's really important that this happens. In the longer term, countries should consider ambitious trade policy measures to significantly reduce plastic pollution.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. And then I think we will quickly go to Mustafa Kamal Guye, but I think he had to leave. So I believe my colleague Peter Wooters will quickly provide his priorities.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. Mustafa kindly sent me through his priorities. In the short term, the governments need to consider what action can be taken to stimulate and support innovation entrepreneurship in order to promote productive employment and decent work in what is now a new economic context. And in the long term, Mustafa is calling for a revamping of productive capacities to ensure resilience, security, and sustainability in the production of production and consumption of goods and services, and linking in with a lot of the rest of the conversation today, particularly on food and health.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Mustafa there. And again, Mr. Shestakov, maybe you have the closing words. What are your 2 priorities, long and shorter term?
Thank you, Natalie. I would join Ambassador in terms of subsidies. So we need immediate subsidies reform, and we need to gain political momentum for that. So I hope very much that tomorrow we will get some elements of it at the summit. Because as soon as we spend more money in destruction than otherwise, so we probably can't progress. And a longer term, what I mentioned, also mainstreaming. So we really like to see that biodiversity is part of all plans, all strategies, and part of all narrative and discussion, including in trade. Thank you.
Well, that has been quite amazing, and I think we'll pull everything together and show the world what you came up with. Very convincing. I want to thank you very much for joining. This has been a really great discussion, and of course it will be put online so others can also hear you. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for the patience with some of the glitches. Thank you also to the organizers at the Graduate Institute. And I hope we all stay in touch and work together towards a more sustainable future. Thank you very, very much. Bye-bye.